What is it about the forests?
People go into the forest to collect mushrooms or capture a stray animal, and they never return.
There are creatures in the forest. Strange creatures who spring up out of the ground if they hear your footsteps.
The devil himself lives in the forest, and he walks up and down in it.
When this triangular UFO landed in the forest, he actually walked up to it. It was like kind of hovering there, just chilling. Maybe not even hovering, because they did find prints. They did find 3 peg marks of where, it had landing gear probably. But anyways, it looked like it was kind of hovering and like malfunctioning. It was making weird sounds and stuff, and had this weird glow below it and stuff, and these weird almost like glowing hieroglyphics or markings that, they didn't recognize, that looked almost like ancient. And he put his hand on it, and he got this like weird feeling, and all of a sudden he just had binary in his head, like this binary language. For those that don't know, binary is a universal language that anyone in the universe can communicate with, ones and zeros and stuff. You can translate it out and stuff. So anyways, for years he would get these ones and zeros, popping up in his head, and he would write them down. He had a journal where he wrote all the sequences of these ones and zeros. And they translated these ones and zeros, and it translated to something about the further advancement of humanity, and it gave a set of coordinates. And when they looked up these coordinates, it actually points exactly where on ancient maps, not even really ancient, but old maps, had this island called Hy Brasil. It used to be on mainly Irish maps, because people in Ireland would see this island off the coast, and sometimes there's one captain who for sure made it to the island, and he spoke of like wizards and giant rabbits and these beings that were able to heal themselves through crystal energy and natural levitation and all this shit, which goes along with a lot of shit we talk about on our podcast. That's why I thought it was fascinating even 10 years ago. I'm like, that's similar to what Atlantis and Lemuria would have been like, this acoustic levitation and healing through crystal energy and all that stuff. Very similar. So it was interesting that those are the stories he told. Most of the time, this island was shrouded in fog. 7 years it would be shrouded in fog, and then it would appear. They said it would like fade away, this fog, and then it would gleam. It had like a shine to it, which makes me think, maybe it's just on a different dimension or something, or it has like a natural cloaking about it. Because that's how Mount Shasta is too. Mount Shasta has this weird cloud around it that people can't fully explain. And Mount Shasta is just weird in a lot of reasons we've talked about a lot on this podcast. But basically, if there is an inner city in Mount Shasta, this Telos that some people talk about, they have this advanced technology that they can cloak themselves. That's why so many people go missing around Mount Shasta, because they get lost. They're going one way 1 second, and all of a sudden they're backwards. They don't know how the fuck they got turned around and stuff, but it's almost like they're going through these mini gateways or these mini vortexes that are, turning them the other way or whatever. Very weird, but they do say that some people actually get so lost, they end up going through these holes through their defense system that actually puts them into Telos, and so a lot of times they have to wipe their memory and send them elsewhere, like in a different part of the country and stuff. And there's stories of this, where people just randomly get amnesia. They go missing, like that dude who walked, it looked like footprint-wise when they looked for him and stuff. It looked like his footprints went into one of the lakes of Lake Michigan, or of Michigan, those Great Lakes. And then all of a sudden, they were gone. They thought maybe he just walked into the water. But then he reappeared in fucking Vermont or some shit, and just woke up and had no recollection of what had happened to him for the last 2-3 months. So that shit kind of happens. And I think Great Lakes, that could possibly be a place where, since there's so many UFO sightings, maybe there's a base inside one of those lakes, and he got lost as well, just like these people around Mount Shasta and shit. So, anyways, getting way off track. Back to Hy Brasil. When I got kind of into it, I did the coordinates backwards. And the coordinates point towards Lake Titicaca. So whether it's a mistranslation or just, complete coincidence, but if you do the coordinates backwards, it's exactly in Lake Titicaca, and supposedly that's where Thoth lives. There's a lot of UFOs that come in and out of Lake Titicaca as well, and so they think, there's something down in that lake that is hidden and stuff. So, and Thoth, he's a teacher, so for further advancement of humanity, go to these coordinates. So maybe it was supposed to be Lake Titicaca or something that the coordinates were supposed to technically point towards, and that's where we're supposed to go for further advancement for our knowledge and stuff, conscious-wise. So anyways, back to the UFO story. It happened a couple nights, because I know after that whole Sergeant Pinnison thing, I think it was 2 nights later, another guy, Halter, Sergeant something, he's on a lot of documentaries as well, but he actually got a good recording of him and his men, like, seeing this light in the sky and stuff, and they reported it and all of that, but then they were told by their commanders and shit just to keep quiet about it and pretend it never happened. So, but they even have a landmark in the Rendlesham Forest of this UFO. Like, it's a very famous story. But like I said, on the internet, people, sleuths and stuff, they've kind of had their way with it, especially people who think it's a hoax. They've definitely gone through on Wikipedia and completely rewritten how the story actually went. So, anyways, on to our next subject, the Green Children of Woolpit. Again, this is kind of a more popular story that maybe a lot of people have heard, because it's very out there, it's very interesting and pretty legit. We can't completely prove it because, it happened in the 11th century, and even, back in those days, history itself was recorded very loosely and, not in a great fashion that we have today. So anyways, these children were in a hole, and these reapers found them, and they had green skin, these children. There was a boy and a girl. The boy was very sickly. He eventually died, unfortunately. And then the girl, she lived and did her thing. And her green skin actually went away, and she just had, like, normal-looking skin. And I don't know if it had something to do with her environment or diet. They think that's possibly what happened to that kid. There is a type of anemia where your skin will turn green if you're on, like, a really poor diet. So they think that kid might have just been on a super poor diet and died from, this anemia of the blood. So she eventually, survived it, though, being on a normal diet and all this stuff. So it makes you wonder, too, like, they say they're from a land called St. Martin's, and it was underground, and all they ate was green beans, and there's always, like, a light or, like, a twilight look about their land. There was no bright sun, because they were actually very taken aback by how bright our sun was. So since they were found in a hole and all this other shit, I feel like personally, this is kind of a random tangent, but I think these kids, if it was a true story, were from an inner Earth area. Because there are cities, even in Turkey and China and stuff, that are ancient, and they were underground. I mean, imagine if things were super, super fucked up out in the surface world, like an ice age or a flood. Maybe people lived underground. So I feel like maybe these people are either remnants of these people that lived underground after the Ice Age and flood and all that shit, or they're people who followed someone like maybe the St. Martin, who I looked into St. Martin himself, the most famous one, and there is a record of him dying. But still, he had a cult. Like, he did have his own followers and all this stuff, and they say they're from the land of St. Martin. So what if, super far out there theory, but the St. Martin had his own, like, society of people, or there was just a society of people who followed some dude into inner Earth, and they had their own society there or whatever, and they accidentally went through maybe a vortex or just some kind of passageway that led them to the surface, and then they, were on the surface world, and maybe they couldn't survive on the surface world without their green beans and and I say that too because if there isn't constant light, like just a twilight, think about it. If there's an inner sun it wouldn't go anywhere. It'd always be right there. And so since it doesn't rotate around anything and it just is in one constant spot, maybe this glow is just an inner light or inner sun that we have in our core. And they were kind of on more of the surface underground. So like they weren't super deep in the earth, so they weren't near the core. But somewhere where they were, one of these caverns or something that are in inner earth, had some of this remnant of sunlight that is constantly glowing in inner earth. So, or just another reality. Some people think they're just from a totally different reality and they went through like a vortex or a wormhole or some kind of parallel universe and they popped up in our world, which is another story that's happened in Rendlesham Forest, where this kid went to go see some people, I think family members or something like that, and he kind of just wound up in this land that was different. Like the sun was different, the lighting was different, the people were still there, but they were also different, and he had a wonderful time and all this shit, but somehow when he walked back, he went through this vortex again, and ended up seeing the people he was supposed to originally see, and they were confused because he said he saw them already and hung out with them, and they're like, no, you didn't. Like, what are you talking about? So he thinks, or people think, that he went through some kind of parallel universe or whatever and stuff. So there's maybe just time gaps or these spaces in our reality where you can accidentally walk through, like glitches in a matrix basically, and end up in a different reality. Or it's just your brain. Maybe your brain is going through some, like a field of some kind of magnetic field that switches it, it's almost like you have a switch in your brain and you can switch into a different reality. That's why we can't see some things, because our reality, our 3D world, we're blocked off to a lot of shit. But if we flipped on a switch in our brain that isn't active, then maybe we can see these things. I was watching a good X-Files episode yesterday about that, how this dude with autism, he could see the ghosts or spirits of these people he was really close with because his brain worked differently, So, anyways, back to the Green Children. I just want to read a quote from a secret history book about this event. This girl actually, since she lived for so long throughout this time and lived and married and all this stuff, she spoke of her personal life and stuff to a lot of people, and so they recorded it. And I'm going to just read a quote from a monk who wrote about this girl who was green-skinned but then wasn't. And she basically, in this quote, is telling about her land. Alright. Being frequently asked about the people of her country, she asserted that the inhabitants and all they had in that country were of green color, and that they saw no sun, but enjoyed a degree of light like what is after sunset. Being asked how she came into this country with a aforesaid boy, she replied that as they were following their flocks, they came to a certain cavern, on entering which they heard a delightful sound of bells, ravished by whose sweetness they went for a long time wandering on through the cavern, until they came to its mouth. When they came out of it, they were struck senseless by the excessive light of sun and the unusual temperature of the air, and they thus lay for a long time, being terrified by the noise of those who came on them. They wished to fly, but they could not find the entrance of the cave before they were caught. So, again, it's interesting. They walked into a cave or something, and then they just all of a sudden were in another reality. That reminds me of that movie John Carter. That's how he got to Mars. I don't know if you guys have seen that movie, but it's a good movie, especially if you believe in like the ancient astronaut theory and stuff, because it shows how, he went to some cave that these Native Americans didn't even want to go to because they knew there was a weirdness about it and all this shit. And he went in there, and then he ended up getting teleported to Mars. And Mars, I don't know what time period, because you can't tell if you're traveling that way to a different planet. Who knows? You might not be in the same time period as the people are on Earth. You could be in the future or the past. But either way, there are these people on that planet, and he, lived on Mars for a while and shit until he found a way back to Earth. But think about it. If we can't see certain planes of existence on our 3D consciousness, then isn't a possibility that some of these planets in our universe and galaxy that we think don't have life actually have life, but we can't see them. We can't comprehend them. They're on a different plane of existence or whatever. So anyways, that's basically my sum up on the Green Children thing. I think it's just interesting. Again, I rabbit holed the whole St. Martin thing. There's an island called St. Martin's near the Netherlands, but other than that, man, like, I can't find anything about a St. Martin's land in Inner Earth or that ever was talked about in esoteric or secret history or whatever. So, anyways. All right, on to the Shug Monkey. Shug Monkey is a Rendlesham Forest Bigfoot. There's two good reports of him that I like. One was in 1992. They described him as an 8-foot baboon. And then in 1956, someone saw him and described him as a 10-foot tall silverback gorilla. So there's been different reports, but always monkey-like. And that's kind of what I think Bigfoot is in general. They're just an evolved type of monkey that's probably been around since before the Ice Age and Flood. So they're spread around the world and all this shit. And there's just different species of them, just like there's different species of humans and stuff. And something interesting about the Shug Monkey, there was one report, a Dutchman and his wife who lived in Britain, they saw him, and then they saw a UFO afterwards. And this happens a lot, you know, Bigfoot and UFOs, you see them kind of in the same area usually, but they said they saw Nordic-like beings peering out of the spacecraft that they were seeing. And that is very similar to what Native Americans say about Bigfoot, that these tiny moons, these orbs, come, drop off Bigfoot or these different kinds of Bigfoot, and then fly off. But the Native Americans said that before they would fly off, they would see the people inside the ship, and they're usually Nordic, you know, blonde hair, blue-eyed, and they'd even like wave at the Native Americans when they would drop these Bigfoot off on their land, and then they would zip off. And then there's the Wild Man of Orford. Orford is near Rendlesham Forest as well. He was caught by fishermen, and I think this was 12th century, and he was kept in a castle near Orford for a few months, and he was bald. He kind of looked like you think of a Bigfoot, you know. He was like a very hairy, big bushy beard, hair all over his body, but he had like a bald head. And that was kind of a different thing than you've heard of other wild men and Bigfoots and stuff. And he never talked. He ate just raw fish. And eventually he just disappeared. They took him out swimming because he liked to go swimming sometimes. And one of the times that they took him out swimming, he just went under the water and disappeared. I never saw him again. And then there's also the witches, or the witch stones of Westelin, which is also very close to Rendlesham Forest. These witches supposedly were summoning the devil and stuff, but turns out that it's probably just a smuggler story. I think smugglers just made it up so that they could get away with smuggling their kegs of ale and all this other shit below. They had like a secret passage under the ground, so they thought it was the devil clanking around down there, but it was really just smugglers trying to sneak shit in. So they made up the story about witches and stuff, since that was a big thing in the 1600s. And then there's the Black Shuck of Bungay. Again, a Rendlesham Forest town. Supposedly it killed 2 villagers at a church near Suffolk in 1577. It's a big black dog with red eyes. They talk about him in Ireland. And honestly, think about it, that's where the werewolf thing came about in Britain. And then we have skinwalkers here in America. And then, I know Asia, they have one as well. I forget what it's called. But every country, they have this like wolf-like being or whatever that can shape into a human or vice versa. Speaking of like a dog or wolf or whatever, we're going to end this Rendlesham Forest little talk with St. Edmund. St. Edmund wasn't quite a saint at the time of his death. He was a monk. He was shot up by arrows by Vikings, and then the Vikings chopped off his head and threw it into the forest. And when British people were like looking for him after the battle and stuff, they kept hearing something in the woods go, "Here, here, here." And so they followed the sound or this voice, and then they found a wolf next to St. Edmund's head. And they couldn't tell, if it was the wolf talking or the head. Both are very unlikely situations. So they thought that was weird, and then they took the head to the body. And supposedly this is where the story gets weird. When they put the head, like, on the body or whatever for the burial, it reattached itself. Don't know how. And, you know, it's very, very weird. But that's why he became Saint Edmund, because it was a miracle that his head somehow reattached itself and all this shit. Speaking of Vikings, though, I did want to talk about them more yesterday on the podcast. Things I want to talk about, though, is the Viking show. It does depict a lot of real stories from Viking times, but then they globbed it all onto Ragnar, and they made Ragnar and his sons from Norway. That's not true. They're from Denmark, and Denmark is the OG country when it comes to raiding and Viking stuff. Norway was also a big Viking country, but they started right after Denmark. So I don't know if it was for TV purposes, if Norway was just a better country to pick when it comes to talking about Vikings, but for some reason, yeah, they just didn't really bring up Denmark at all on the Viking show. There were some good stories in there, though, that they depicted. Like, one of my favorite parts is when that really big dude, huge Viking, he was about to get his head cut off by this French king or whatever, and he asked the executioner if he could hold his hair, because, you know, he loved his hair so much he didn't want it to get cut along with his head. So they did. They held his hair, but at the angle that they were holding it, right when the axe was coming down, he pulled his head back, and it caused the Frenchman or the executioner's hands to fucking get in front of the axe, and then he got his hands chopped off. So that's classic, because that did happen. That was a Norway battle, though. It was a Danish mercenary who was in Norway, and he got caught with his men, and they were all being executed, and that was his last thing. And he got set free for doing that, for being so clever to pull back his hair and get the dude's hands cut off. They actually laughed about it and let the Dane go, and his men. And I just think that's fucking dope. And there's so many stories of that, too. There's another podcaster who's actually done a whole thing about Danish Vikings. They always have a good, clever wit about them and shit. So I think that's dope. But anyways, one of the other good stories that happened, not through Ragnar's eyes, it was a different Viking, but the whole story where he stormed the Vatican. He tricked them by pretending he was dead, and he wanted a Christian burial, so they took his body into the Vatican, and that's how he penetrated the Vatican, was pretending he was dead. And then he came out of the coffin and fucking took some prisoners and took over the city and shit. And they depicted that in the Viking show, with Ragnar doing that in France with Paris and stuff. He wanted to sack Paris. But it technically happened in Italy, the real story. And just like a fun fact, Viking-wise, I don't think a lot of people realize that the Vikings did take over England for a few years. Like, there was a Danish king and everything. And so I don't think the Danes get enough credit, because they were in charge of even Ireland, too. Even Ivar the Boneless ruled over Ireland for a short time. So, you know, that's why a lot of British and Irish people, like, a lot of their bloodline actually goes back to Scandinavians and stuff, because there's even Dublin, the capital of Ireland, was actually founded because it was a Viking base. Vikings actually made that a city. So that's just where they would camp out and stuff before they would go raid, was this Dublin area, and then it became a city. So if it wasn't for the Vikings, honestly, a lot of shit wouldn't even exist in Ireland and Britain. Things would be very different. But one of the last kind of fun things I'm going to get into, kind of conspiracy theory in my mind, because I have a very far out there theory I don't think anyone else has thought of about this, but the Greenland Vikings. There was 8,000 Vikings in Greenland at one point in like the 1100 AD era, and they all just disappeared. All their shit was just gone. They could never find the bodies or anything like that. Some people think, you know, maybe they froze to death or Eskimos killed them or something, but again, they couldn't find any evidence of anything bad happening to them. And since there's these stories of these Nordic beings in inner Earth, or just like UFO-wise, I think it's like some of these Eskimos that just vanished without any trace. Like maybe there's UFOs or aliens or our ancient ancestors guiding them back, or guiding them into inner Earth, or guiding them somewhere. or just taking them, because some of these Eskimos that go missing too, like there's no fucking footprints, there's nothing, they're just gone. So I think in these isolated areas, especially if we're like an experiment or something like that, those isolated areas, there's not going to be any witnesses. So if aliens or our ancient ancestors wanted to take them or do something to them or whatever, those isolated ones up north in the ice and shit would probably be the best to go after, experiment with. So I like to think, though, that the 8,000 Greenland Vikings, though, went into inner Earth. They found the North Pole entrance, the inner Earth, and they're just living down there and shit. But, you know, that's a far out there theory. But speaking of Viking shit, let's just get into our bonus tracks. So a good Viking story that a lot of people think is made up, and it definitely could be. There's proof that it's probably made up, but there's a story of Leif Erikson going to Canada and running into a Bigfoot, and they actually fought the Bigfoot on 2 different occasions and stuff like that, and there was a couple of Vikings that were killed by the Bigfoot. And I just think that's a fun story, you know, Bigfoot versus a Viking and stuff, and I see it as a possibility, though. There's a lot of Bigfoot encounters on the East Coast and then Canada and all this shit, so I like to think that it's a possibility. But I actually want to read a quote from a secret history book about Bigfoot real quick that I found interesting when I stumbled upon the Leif Erikson story. I think, again, with all this evidence of early settlers seeing Bigfoot, it is a possibility. The quote is by Lauren Coleman. When Europeans colonized from the east to the west, their initial encounters were with the rare eastern Bigfoot, which the native they met spoke of. The first Americans acknowledged these hairy races, and their tales come down to us in the records that ethnographers, folklorists, and anthropologists have preserved and overlook, as said on hairy giant legends and myths. The Bigfoot figure is common to the folklore of most Northwest Native American tribes. Native American Bigfoot legends usually describe the creatures as around 6 to 9 foot tall, very hairy, strong, uncivilized, and often foul-smelling, usually living in the woods and often foraging at night. In some native stories, Bigfoot may have minor supernatural powers, the ability to turn invisible, for example. But they are also considered physical creatures of the forest, not spirits or ghosts. In the Bigfoot myths of some tribes, Sasquatch and his relatives are generally shy and benign figures. They may take things that do not belong to them or even kidnap a human wife, but do not harm people and may even come to their aid. Sometimes Bigfoot is considered a guardian of nature in these tribes. These more benevolent Bigfeet usually appear alone or in small family unit, and may exchange gifts or use sign language to communicate with Native American communities. But Bigfoot legends from other tribes describe them as malevolent creatures who attack humans, play dangerous tricks on them, and steal children. They may even eat people. These more dangerous Bigfoot monsters, known as stick Indians or bush Indians, are sometimes found in large groups or even villages, which engage in warfare with neighboring Indian tribes, which I've heard about that too in Northwest culture. And that's where there's so much evidence, bro. Like, I've been watching that Bigfoot expedition show, and honestly, they found some fucking legit shit, bro. They saw like this shadow of this Bigfoot running or whatever. It's like exactly a Bigfoot, and then the shadow just like disappeared. Like, they just disappear, man. They'll have them on infrared behind a tree, and then all of a sudden there's nothing behind that tree anymore. Like, you'll see them peeking out and shit, and then they're gone. And then one time they're in a cave and they use LiDAR, and they could see with the camera and the LiDAR both. Well, just the camera, they couldn't see anything. But with the LiDAR, there was something there. There was like this ape figure that was like crouched and like had its back turned and stuff, like it was hiding. So it was like, it was invisible to the camera, but you could totally see it on LiDAR and everything, that there was an actual being in front of them. And then in that same cave, they would see this invisible, like, it was almost like a heat wave when you see a heat wave off the road, but it was just in the middle of this cave and it was just moving about like an invisible person walking around or something. Like, it was weird. So I think they do have some kind of ability to camouflage themselves or change their molecules and stuff and make so like light and all that shit goes around them, like it doesn't hit them, so like they're not visible to the naked eye and shit. Very weird. They must be very, very ancient creatures that have abilities like that. But anyways, a lot of that shit. We're going to talk about a lot of Bigfoot expedition shit on our next episode with my co-host Caitlin. So stay tuned. We're also going to talk about super soldiers and the secret Mars program and all that shit. So anyways, thanks for listening and take it easy. Stay cheesy. Keep that third eye open.